Don't adjust your device, you are having a crisis. Welcome to Crushing Crisis Ink and Wax. My name is Krisis with a K, and this is a show where I hang out with one of my favorite people to talk about comic books and music, but not just any comic books and music. Today, I am joined by my frequent companion in comics, my friend in fingerstyle, my partner in purple. Please welcome to the stage, Max Appelman.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this podcast.
Yeah, for everybody listening, it's number one, but in our minds, this has been happening for a long, long time already. So we're in it, and we've been in it for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, typically on this show, which you are experiencing for the first time right now, one of us will pick a comic and the other one will pick music, and we will share our picks and listen and read and then share our opinions. But for these first few episodes, the lines are a little bit more fuzzy. So this episode, I've kind of been the one to put my thumb on the scale and nudge us in the direction of the things that we're picking, although it's two things, as you will learn, that Max cares about a lot. Next episode, Max will be putting his thumb on the scale a little bit, and then we will start to do the alternating. So on this episode, we are going to be talking about writer Kieron Gillen's first run on the original 1963 volume of Uncanny X-Men at Marvel. His run ran from issue 534.1 to 544, which ended that volume, and we'll get into all of the specifics about that in just a moment. And then we're going to be discussing the 1983 album Let's Dance by David Bowie. It was his biggest commercial success at the time, and in many areas of the globe to the end of his career, his biggest commercial success. But before we get into either of those things, Max, I have a moment of crisis for you that I want to hear your off-the-cuff thoughts on, and that is critical reassessments. Sometimes works of art, they get critically reassessed later, either by critics, by the public, or just by you because you got older and you listen to them again. But when you hear about a critical reassessment or do one yourself, do you ever change your mind? Or do you find that, no, it's the same thing it's always been?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It kind of depends. When I was in my teens, when I did most of my different types of music devouring, I would sometimes stumble across a record and feel like this might be cool, but just not where I'm currently at personally. Like I would be very into I don't know, someone like Tom Waits or something. And then a record would come along by Joni Mitchell, and I would listen to it. I was like, well, this is something that I would appreciate more after I get out of my current obsession. So I would usually put things on hold until I felt like I was open enough to appreciate them more. And this isn't a movie show, but that's also my forte. And with movies, there's always this thing, like a movie we both very much enjoy is Rocky Horror. When that movie came out, it did not do well, but then it turned into being one of the most, famous and well-celebrated movies of all time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you kind of hit the two sides of it that I was thinking about when I thought up this moment of crisis, is that personally, I really put a lot of thought and strength into my first blush reaction on something. I've listened, I'm a huge consumer of music and comic books. I consume hundreds, if not thousands a year. And I feel like there's a lot to be said for how something leaves you feeling the first time. And especially with music, I don't really feel like I care so much about albums that are like, people are like, you got to let it sink in. I'm like, there is too much music in the world, and the sand in my hourglass is flowing towards the bottom. I don't have time to listen to a perhaps terrible album 8 times in a row to decide if it's going to sink in or not. So I think from that perspective, I don't really believe in critical reassessment, because I'm like, if it wasn't good enough to be evident early on, then it probably wasn't good enough. But now in my dotage, I've definitely grown old enough that I'm re-listening to some things or even reading some comics again, where I'm like, oh, sometimes you just need some life experience to like fully get that. Some albums about deep heartbreak, some comics about like, the rise and then the fall. Sometimes you like can't fully appreciate that at the ripe old age of 18 or whenever you encounter it. And so sometimes I think for me, it's less critical reassessment and it's more like a life experience based reassessment where I'm like, oh, I get that now. I think that's a little bit more common for me. So now I feel like it's all the rage that some big review site is like critically reassessing the so-and-so album that we said was crappy before, but now it's great. And I'm like, yeah, I knew it was great from the start.
It to me kind of ties into the different types of music and the different types of listening required to appreciate such music. So if you listen to like a pop song or whatever, it's very much designed to be accessible and digestible as soon as you hear it. But if you were to listen to like a pretty long form instrumental music type thing, you can't really listen to that hoping to hear a hook really quickly, because that's probably not going to happen. So you'd have to go in with a different kind of mindset.
And that is going to lead to one of the more interesting challenges for the two of us coming together. And this is we depart from things we both broadly love, because I am a pop girly. I like to hook immediately and I make quick decisions. And Max is going to make me listen to some jazz. So that's going to get really, really interesting. And that's one of the many reasons you should stay tuned to Ink and Wax. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ink here, which is the comic book. The comic books we read for today are Uncanny X-Men 1963. Issues 535 through 554. That's from Marvel, and that was released over the course of 2010 and 2011. What's remarkable or notable about this is it's the end of that first volume of Uncanny X-Men. It's written by Kieron Gillen. Kieron Gillen had been around at that point. He had done some indie work. He had done some miniseries at Marvel, and he was just in the middle of this run starting the work that he's probably the best known for Marvel other than X-Men, which is his work on Journey into Mystery with Loki, which then led into Young Avengers. Now, the X-Men as a franchise were just coming out of a period where they were incredibly, incredibly isolated for several years, because coming out of House of M, there were so few mutants, because House of M decimated them. Then we moved into the Messiah complex, and we saw the X-Men have some hope for the future, both figurative and literal, but they were getting increasingly backed into a corner to the point that they wound up on their own island in the San Francisco Bay called Utopia, and then all of that came to a head in a massive crossover, one of my favorites, maybe we'll do it at some point, called Second Coming. So this is, after all that, the X-Men have kind of gotten rid of all of the impediments that were in their way, the things that were backing them up against the wall, and now they have a chance to actually like make a statement as the mutant race. Like, what does it mean to be assembled mutants with no major predators, or predator X's as the case may be, kind of backing them into a corner? And that's where Kieron Gillen takes over for Matt Fraction, starting with his issue 534.1, which we covered on a pilot episode that was just for patrons, and now we're starting with his first full-time issue 535. There's actually 4 arcs in this run, well, 2 arcs and 2 single issues, and this represents about a quarter of the Kieron Gillen Uncanny X-Men Omnibus. So Max, let me start out with the simplest question, and then we'll get more complex from there. As the newer reader of the two of us on this, did you enjoy your read of this run?
Yes, very much so, yeah.
And how did this portion of the run, knowing we're only talking about getting through issue 544, how did it make you feel?
Well, like I wanted to read more, because a lot of the issues are quite fast reads. Some of them have a lot of pages, or some pages that only have the art telling the story. You don't really have a lot of dialogue in them in some issues, and then you go through them quite quickly. It doesn't seem to linger too long on things, or waste a lot of time. So you have a feeling of gotta keep it going.
And notably because it came out in an Uncanny X-Men by Kieron Gillen Omnibus. Now,
Yes.
not to be confused by X-Men with Kieron Gillen, which also collects his work, but from the Krakoa period. And so this represents about a quarter of the stuff in that omnibus. He goes on to write another one, which we'll cover at some point as well. So, I have to feel like I have to disclose up front, I am in the tank for Kieron Gillen. He's probably one of my 3 favorite comic book writers. I already was in love with him at this point, just from his indie stuff. I wasn't in the depth of obsession that I have with him now. So this has been interesting to go back to, because I was just excited for him to take over the book. And we start out with an arc from 535 through 538 that basically, it's so weird because it's his first arc on the title, but he's using it to put a resolution to a plot point that I don't really feel like that needed any resolution, which was the final arc, and really the whole series, of Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. Because Astonishing X-Men is framed by the X-Men having a conflict with these aliens from the break world. They're introducing all of these problems. The X-Men go to the break world. They kind of free them from despotic rule, or did they? Because they're a whole society that's kind of ruled by violence. So what does it mean when there's no more violent rule and a society rules by violence? To me, pour moi, that story was done. Like, I didn't go, oh, I wonder what's happening on the break world still. And yet Kieron Gillen chooses to spend 4 of his initial issues bringing the whole break world thing back, which must have been very puzzling for people who didn't read Astonishing X-Men, which had been over for over 2 years at this point. What did you feel when you like turned the page to 535 and you realized what mission they were on, and you were like, oh, this is like the sequel to Astonishing X-Men?
Well, I mean, I have read Astonishing X-Men, so to me, it made sense. So that was cool, and I'm a big fan of the characters involved. You know, I love Kitty, and I at times enjoy Peter, so that made me excited for it.
Interesting. I think at the time I was excited because I was so fresh off of Astonishing X-Men reeling me back in to reading X-Men. Now with that critical reassessment, I'm like, gosh, that's a very weak position to start your blockbuster run. I mean, everybody wishes to be writing X-Men, and you come onto X-Men, and I do respect people who pick up old plot threads, but to be like, oh, I'm going to continue plot threads from this run that many people see as untoppable, especially at that time, only a couple of years later. But maybe that was Gillen's way of being like, hey, this is relevant. I'm picking, you know, I'm closing off threads. Personally, I was kind of surprised he didn't start with something brand new, but Gillen very quickly had acquired this reputation as the finisher. He was like the guy you brought in when the original plot wasn't going to make it over the line. We met him finishing off Michael Straczynski's run on Thor, and so he already kind of had that reputation. So it wasn't like surprising at the time. Now, knowing everything that he's capable of, I'm like, wow, strange choice. But I agree with you that I think part of it was a way to foreground Kitty, and I think that Kitty's big story that anybody knew in the modern day was Joss Whedon, because of course Joss Whedon based Buffy and Willow on Kitty, so she was absolutely the main character of his Astonishing X-Men run, and this was a way to be like, well, what's the biggest Kitty story we can resolve? She's totally intangible right now in the comics because she came back from being stuck in space without the ability to phase back into reality. Oh, I know, we can continue the story that left her in that state to begin with. So I do kind of get the thing that he's going for there. But the thing that was really interesting to me as we dug into the story is that we're kind of playing with the idea of cultural conflict. Like the X-Men thought they were bringing peace to Breakworld by breaking their despotic hold on the world, only to find that like violence was order there. Was there any right of the X-Men to impose a totally different order based on totally different cultural norms? Then we have the Breakworld people coming to Earth and basically be like, hey, we need know how to do is take power. And so since you defeated us once, even though we have all these people who are refugees, the only way we can think to make it right is to like beat you down and take your power. So it's a fundamental mismatch of like what each society thinks a state of peace, or not even peace because they don't even agree on peace, a state of status quo should look like.
How do you feel about the art in this? Because I know you have a certain, well, you go ahead.
Well, look, I probably should have said up front, this initial arc is art by Terry Dodson, inked by Rachel Dodson. The colors are by Justin Posner, and the letters are by Joe Caramagna. Terry Dodson in this period I do enjoy, but he draws everything so soft and pillowy, which is wonderful, not only for drawing women in a cheesecakey way, but when you're drawing a woman who's supposed to look soft and romantic in some way. And I think Kitty is very romantic here because she's like being seen as this romantic lead paired with Colossus. But then it doesn't always work for me when we're like looking at like, I don't know, Psylocke or Emma Frost. Like sometimes they just look a little too soft and pillowy to me. Even his Cyclops kind of like looks a little bit like weird and round. And it's if I've come around in a critical reassessment, I think over the years I just have less and less patience for the lack of differentiation between the figure work and Dodson, which is funny because he is the more well-liked artist of this group of artists that we're going to be talking about. For me personally, I just don't see it. It just feels like round faces on everybody. And then when he draws these very orc-looking people from the off-world, I'm like, oh, that looks good because he's not trying to draw human faces. He's trying to draw this totally other thing. And I'm like, well, that's interesting because it feels like there's actual differentiation between them. When he's drawing people faces, they all kind of just look like these weird round muffins.
Right. So Colossus is Metal Jay Leno in this.
He has quite a chin.
Yes. It's but whenever he's in non-metal form, in other genres, when he's in human form, he looks so old to me, like compared to Kitty. I know there's a bit of an age gap, but it's maybe 4 years difference or something.
Yes,
I'm not
canonically,
sure.
I believe it is 4.
Right. He looks like a lot. He looks about 10 years her senior or something. That kind of stuck out to me. Yeah.
And also, I think in terms of plot, you can always go back to the well for like a Cure the X-Men issue. And I think ultimately what you need to know about the plot of these issues is that these castaways from Breakworld come and the X-Men say, we'll accept you since we're the people who put you in the position to be castaways. And immediately we find out that their deposed leader has a big plan where he's going to temporarily cure all of the X-Men of their mutancy so he can get revenge on Colossus and Kitty, who ultimately were the ones who defeated him to begin with. But this is like 4 whole issues of basically like a mutant cure storyline, which is so often the main storyline in modern day X-Men. And we also get one whole issue where Kitty can't talk and she's totally intangible and she's just floating around, and it's kind of in the style of a horror movie where he keeps showing up and be like, I already paralyzed Scott Summers, I already put Emma Frost into a coma, until finally they get to Wolverine and he's like, he shouldn't even be able to sense me, and Wolverine's like, you're wrong, bub. And it's again, like, I just, looking back now with hindsight and critical reassessment, I'm like, this was a lot of bold choices for Gillen to do a story that refers to somebody else's comic book, to do a story that's like not very imaginative in terms of the theme, and to do a story that like really mainstreams Kitty as the main character and gives most of the other characters very little to do other than Namor kind of briefly saving the day. There's really not much for anybody else to do. And so it's just kind of like, I probably now, as a modern reader, if I was going back and reading this omnibus, I'd be like, why are you people always saying how great Gillen is? I think it heats up immediately after this. But I do somewhat hope that this is the last time I ever read these first 4 issues.
I would say that it started off plot-wise, it felt like tying off loose ends, just finishing things that were kind of like dangling, and then setting things up to tell something new. But the way every character is introduced and immediately has their voice right, like the way Namor shows up and is basically like, well, that's him, and then correcting Peter on how to say Imperius Rex and all those things, I very much enjoyed. Even though the plot itself might not have been amazing, I thought just how he voiced all the characters was really fun.
Well, that's an interesting contrast to my reaction, because I mean, these X-Men characters very well at this point, but for me, I just caught up on like decades of X-Men, and I was reading this pretty much freshly as it was coming out in trade paperback. So to me, probably a lot of that stuff is a little bit lost, because I was like, yeah, I know Cyclops' voice, but like reading it as the first big adventure of the X-Men in this omnibus, when you haven't been reading continuously like 60 or 100 issues of X-Men, I actually can see your point that like by having the Breakworld folks systematically disassemble each of the main X-Men in the cast, you kind of get to know everything about the voice and the powers of Cyclops, Emma, Wolverine, Magneto, Namor, without being like, this is my power, I dive in the water and then I have wings on my feet, this is my power, I'm psychic. Like, it kind of shows you what their powers are by the negative space of what happens, which when he takes them away, one of the most interesting elements is of Magneto, who's like so interested in this metal that comes from the Breakworld, and he realizes that he's got to take Magneto off the map first, because Magneto actually poses the greatest threat, because so much of his plan to defeat the X-Men hinges on the use of the metal of the Breakworld. And so without ever being like, yes, I am the master of magnetism, like, he kind of, it still tells you that, because Magneto has access to metal and he identifies him immediately as the biggest threat. So I can see your point there.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the whole philosophy that Stan Lee and such had back in the early days, where every comic book should be a possible first comic book for any reader. So it will always remind you with like what everyone does and such. But Gillen does it a little more eloquently than just having a box that says, this is Magneto, he does metal, like they did back in the day. So after the first 4, I think then we get to the, to me, standout issue, which is centered around one of my favorite characters, full stop. This is basically just a story about Hope and Logan. And the art being very different made it stand out even more, which I very much appreciated. I really like this issue.
So now we're talking about issue Uncanny X-Men 539. It's still written by Kieron Gillen, but the art is by Ibraim Roberson. The color is by Jim Charlamidis, and the letters are Joe Caramagna. It is also one of my favorite issues in this run. And for those of you who don't know, Hope Summers was a baby who was born at the end of the Messiah Complex story that then travels into the future with Cable, and Cyclops basically says to his own time-lost son, Cable, I need you to do the play that we did with you. You've got to take her into the future and let her become an adult there, because A, we don't have the time to wait 20 years for her to become an adult, and B, she's at too much risk here in the present. So she comes back. All of that is told in Second Coming, which is an amazing blockbuster story. But now we're in this world where we're on utopia with this character that they've all desperately been waiting to come and fix something or solve something. And we see very quickly in an arc that's shortly before Kieron Gillen gets here that she can activate new mutants, which is something that hadn't been happening for a while. And she also maybe can fix the powers of mutants who have lost their powers for any given reason. And that's where we pick up this issue. So she's kind of on the island. Kieron Gillen also is writing her series separately called Generation Hope. And this almost reads as if it's an issue of Generation Hope that has just kind of somehow escaped and become an issue of of Uncanny X-Men instead. But we see that Hope gets kidnapped by an old X-Men foe from the 210s of Uncanny X-Men Claremont years named Crimson Commando. Here, I think Gillen turns him into the most compelling version of that character he has ever been. Max, had you ever read Crimson Commando in a comic book before?
No, I had no idea who it was.
Oh, so did you think he was invented, or did you believe he was like real and he had come back?
I didn't really put too much thought into it. I think either he would be invented by Gillen just for the story that the issue is really about, or, you know, that's a callback since he loves to call back.
He loves mining this old stuff and these old connections. And this was a character who had been a speedster. He's kind of like Quicksilver, but he also has been alive for a really long time. And Claremont kind of makes him out to just be this like elderly fast guy. And then he gets killed shortly after Claremont leaves in the early 90s, or so we think. And here we see not only has he been depowered, but he's also been turned into this weird kind of cyborg. And he's like, he's saying to Hope, like, well, at least if you touch me, I could get my powers back. And then it's so short-sighted of him because like he could think of all the things you could do for mutants all around the globe with Hope under your control. But he's just like, touch me and give me my powers back.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say he's a very deep character, but he served his purpose for the issue.
Not a deep
Right. Well, I mean, what stood out to me in this issue was, well, beside the art, which I really liked, and the colors were fantastic. It was that, especially near the end, there was a lot of Cable coming through, like, because he raised Hope, and he taught her how to take care of situations, and she very much did, and she basically used Logan as a kind of plot device at one point, which I very much enjoyed.
Well, because Hope's powers are basically to mimic or borrow the mutant powers of any number of people around her. She's a lot like Sync in that way, an old Generation X character. And so it's like really hard to hold Hope hostage and do any significant damage to her while she's got Wolverine around. But then the great twist at the end of this, which is to me why this issue is very memorable, is that Hope is like, oh, I'm happy you were close enough that I could borrow your power, but you seem like you're keeping me at arm's length. And Wolverine's like, yeah, I've got to keep you at arm's length because eventually I'm probably going to have to kill you. Like, he's like, that's the way this always goes. We always have somebody who we think is going to be a savior and we think is going to be important, whether it's Jean, whether it's Magneto. And in the end, I'm the only one who will actually do the job. And I just know I'm going to have to kill you eventually, so I don't want to get all that close, which is so interesting because it's playing out at the same time that Jason Aaron is writing a truly, truly deep and dark version of Wolverine in the ongoing Wolverine 2010 title, where we're seeing just how often Wolverine has to kill people that he deeply, deeply regrets having to kill. So there's a really nice crosstalk between the titles, even if you read them long after the fact.
Right, and then her reaction to it was very Hope. It was very Cable. It was, not the, because I think she asks him, "Can you promise me something?" And then Wolverine is like, "To make it quick," and no, to make sure, which is very Cable.
Well, also it's very rooted in Hope's background as kind of traipsing through all these post-apocalyptic futures where Bishop was hunting her down and committing kind of worldwide genocide because he really thought if she went back to the present, everything would go wrong. And so Hope has seen what it's like for somebody to totally go bad. And she's like, if I go bad, you can't hesitate. So most people are like, make it quick, make it painless. And Hope's like, make it last, make it stick, which is a very Cable sort of sentiment. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect issue. I that was my favorite one in the ones we read anyway.
And also Ibraim Roberson's such an interesting art choice here because his art It's so textured. It feels like really, he feels like somebody who was like drawing from life. Like he was in like some kind of life drawing class, capturing people's expression and their body language. He's just really a lot of like fine lines. And I think I didn't credit an inker, right? So he's inking himself there. And I just think it's so different from the gloss level that the Dodsons have. And then the next artist, Greg Land, has, that it like really can't help but stick out.
So then we get to the issues that that have your preference in a very specific, particular way.
This next arc, it's 4 issues tying into Fear Itself, which was a line-wide crossover in 2011, where some of the major Marvel characters, both heroes and villains, were given these kind of evil hammer versions of Mjolnir, and they were turned into tools of the Serpent, who's this big bad Asgardian bad guy. And right at the beginning of the first issue of this, in issue 540, we see that Juggernaut is actually one of the heroes, villains, who knows what we should call Juggernaut, who gets one of these hammers, and he becomes the unstoppable force. I think his name is Kurth, something like that. And so now he is charging towards the X-Men in California. And this is drawn by Greg Land, who, if anybody could draw me right now, I would pick Greg Land. I love Greg Land. It is not a bit. You need to know this early on in the show so you know that when we return to it, it is not a bit. Greg Land is one of my favorite artists because he draws from life, but he doesn't draw from life with like a lot of lines and shading. He draws from life as one might trace over a magazine. But because of that, he does really cool facial features. Like his faces feel really well proportioned. The noses look like real noses. The hair, he draws big, beautiful hair. But then also a lot of his faces get very samey because maybe he's using the same magazines a lot. I don't know. I'm not here to judge him because I love him. But he's inked by Jay Leaston. And I will say at this point, if you compare this to Greg Land from 5 or 10 years later, it's a lot more drawing. Like he's doing a lot of intentional things. There's a lot of shading. There's a lot of characters that don't just kind of look frozen. They actually look like they're interacting in their space. There's some choices he makes that are weird. I don't think he has a good character model for Iliad and Rasputin Magic. Like she's never had this long, beachy, waved hair that she has here. She's always got like blunt cut bangs. And it's just like it feels like he's drawing her the same as he's drawing Emma Frost. So I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm just saying I love him. And he doesn't have to be perfect because I still will love him. But what do you think about it? I don't know if I've ever heard you say out loud your feelings on Greg Land.
You have not, for good reason. No,
no.
Well, there's there's parts of it that I really like, and there's things about it that I do not enjoy very much. Like what you just mentioned, Ilyana looking pretty much identical to Emma. If you took out all the text, it would just look like Emma was starting to recall a flashback or something, because they look the same. Like Magic doesn't have her bangs or anything, which is like the easiest thing to draw, though. I mean, she was being held in captivity, so it's kind of hard to maintain.
Yeah, maybe your hair was growing out.
I like whenever, but I really like when Greg Land draws big action stuff. I like his monster designs, and I like he does hair really well. I just don't like how he does faces.
I've always said that he's actually really great at like monstrous stuff. I think it's a particular talent of his because he has to really plan the shape of that thing in the space. He can't just pick some figure that he knows has worked in the past and kind of like rework it into the space. So like whenever like the Juggernaut, there's been a lot of drawings of the Juggernaut, but this big monstrous demonic sort of looking version of the Juggernaut that's also this other thing entirely. Like he's got to like draw something original to make that work. And I think when he draws this later, he like 5 years later, he draws Monsters Unleashed. I think that those are some of my favorite Greg Land art because I think and even later in Gillen's run, which we're not going to get to today, he draws an issue that's kind of in the world with all these weird, creepily, evolved creatures that have evolved, had millions of years of evolution separate from us. Those are some of my favorite things that Greg Land does. Mm-hmm. But I will say that I think here in this 4 issues of Fear Itself, he draws what, for me, pour moi, is the most iconic Cyclops. And a huge part of that is because he's in the costume that John Cassaday designed for him in Astonishing X-Men. And Justin Posner colors him so brilliantly with this like dark blue in his costume and this super reflective visor that's like always picking up everything that's happening in the scene around him. And I just think every single panel of Cyclops, this is one of the best Cyclops arcs we'd ever had at this time. It has, they're trying to stop the Juggernaut from running into San Francisco, and their first plan doesn't work. And so the mayor of San Francisco says, well, what are you going to try now? Plan B? And Scott turns to her and says, one of the best Cyclops lines of all time, Plan B implies we only have 26. Like you're realizing very quickly, oh, wow, Gillen has a real plan for this. And also Land just makes him look really freaking cool.
Yeah. And a part of that as well is the color work on this, because all the metal looks very metal. Everything looks very shiny when it's meant to look shiny. I thought that was really made everything come to life,
And also I think that Greg Land I think it's funny because he's known for cheesecake and drawing women and these very kind of like sexy women. I think he's better at drawing muscular men. Because not only is his Cyclops great in this, his Namor is magnificent. And he like goes to town shading in all the muscles on his back. And I'm like, maybe we have him drawn the wrong sexy gender this whole time. Maybe everybody's got it wrong about my man, Greg Land.
That is a fair point. Yeah. He he just loves his anatomy and he goes all in. He's an equal opportunist anatomy admirer.
But what's great about the fact that Cyclops has 26 plans here is that we get to see such a fun assortment of mutants, and this really brings forward an idea that we'll encounter later in Krakoa of mutant circuits. Like, what mutants can we combine together to make interesting things happen? What happens when we bring together Siren and Dazzler? Some pretty amazing things. But we also get the X-Men kind of fighting off their own control of this creature that's the Serpent who's driving the Juggernaut. And we even get Emma briefly hypnotized by it, and we see Emma approaching Hope to smother her with a pillow, which is one of my favorite pages. If I could own any X-Men page, it's Emma creeping across the hospital room with the pillow. It's just something so funny about it to me.
Well, I mean, I always appreciate when there's a page that just tells you everything without using words, because the visual aspect of the medium is very important, and I like when they trust the artist to convey that clearly.
Ultimately, the most interesting outcome of this, it's not the fear itself part. I mean, it's a very little slice of the overall story of this line-wide event that they turn back the Juggernaut. And ultimately, we get a lot of cool Cyclops stuff, but that's not really the best thing about it either. The most interesting thing is Colossus, and Colossus via the actions of Magic. It turns out that we find out that Magic and Cyclops have this deal that Magic is going to use her portals to go into the hell dimension that's inhabited by Sideric, who is the demon who gives Juggernaut his power. And she's basically going to go and say, like, hey, did you know your Cain Marco Juggernaut has left you for another god? He's made a cuckold of you. And then the plan is that she's going to make him so angry that he's going to withdraw the Juggernaut power from Marco, and that if he's got to give it to somebody, you might as well give it to Magic, because Magic has a lot of experience with these things as the Dark Child. But stupid, altruistic, always has to protect somebody, Colossus, or at the last possible second, basically dives in front of his finger and gets touched instead, and Colossus becomes the Juggernaut, which is definitely an interesting character beat for Peter, a character that they often really don't know what to do with.
Yeah, very, very much. Well, I very much enjoy that ending because of the parallel that him having that parallels with Magic and having the Dark Child, because it also brings that's in similar issue or related issues later on that isn't part of our current discussion, but it gets brought up and is used to kind of give perspective to Peter, to what Magic has been dealing with for a long time now.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is that Peter's perspective is like, well, I'm strong and she's my sister and she shouldn't have to bear all the weight, so I will do this. But Peter's had a very different life than Illyana. Illyana literally grew up in limbo. She went through almost a decade of unending torture, that no matter if we read this as the same canonical Illyana or Illyana missing one shard of her soul, there's a lot of kind of different theories even that the X-Men have at this point, that she's had a very different life that she uses to keep that demonic self in check. And guess what? She does not always keep it in check. And so Colossus kind of approaches this saying like, it's fine, I'll be able to handle it. And also, I think what's unwritten here, but I think it's still implied by that choice and perspective from him, is that like how hard can it be? Kane Marco's a moron. Like, it's kind of like he's Professor X's dumb half brother. If he could be the Juggernaut, surely Colossus, one of the most famous X-Men of all time, could be the Juggernaut. How hard could it be?
That's a good point. I hadn't considered that, but yeah.
But we see him take on this power of the Juggernaut, and Kane Marco then loses the Juggernaut power and only has the power of the Serpent. And we see him just beat back Kane Marco and beat him, basically send him backwards on the path that he's been on until he finally disappears in retreat. And we see Colossus is so satisfied, even though his bones are splintering beneath the steel, beneath the Juggernaut helmet as they're having this fight. He's satisfied because now he can't be stopped. And it does kind of make you think of like how many times in Colossus's past that he's tried to make the altruistic sacrifice for somebody and it didn't matter. Like, you know, Illyana dies. You know, he is the one who sacrifices himself for the legacy virus, and he dies. Like, he loves throwing himself in front of something or reacting to something. And finally, like, here's a version of Colossus that has the power to throw himself in front of something and no one can stop him. And to me, that's what you keep going back to with like Gillen really gets these characters. For a character that hardly anybody has ever injected any kind of personality into other than he's friends with Kurt, I just think that is such an amazing beat to play for Colossus.
Yeah, full agreement. Yeah, I thought it was really nicely done, and it gives a certain tension and stakes to the rest of, to the cast, basically.
Well, and even his relationship with Kitty, which we think has just been healed so much by this first arc that we talked about. But then this ends with her saying, it's great that you're willing to die for me, Pete, but I need someone who's willing to at least consider living. And so this beautiful thing that we thought that we had, which was like, oh, well, they're going to be the romantic leads in this book, actually immediately evaporates. And that's like a really cool magic trick on Gillen's part. And even more so, I think, as we roll into this final issue of Uncanny X-Men, which at the time was the longest running continuously numbered Marvel title. Spider-Man had recaptured its old numbering, but Spider-Man had been renumbered in 1999. Amazing Spider-Man started again from number 1. Uncanny X-Men had never been renumbered. So this was a big deal that we got to the last issue. And what's interesting is that Schism, which was this X-Men event, happened pretty much alongside the Fear Itself arc. But even if you had never read Schism, which I don't think you have you?
No.
But Gillen gives you all the elements. He gives you Kitty and Peter breaking up. He gives Iceman saying to Scott, what does he say? Sorry for still having human emotions, Scott, when Scott like implies that he's like going to do whatever it takes to stop this villain. It gives you kind of all of the fractures of the Schism without giving you the Schism story, so that when we get to 544, which basically is looking at Schism aftermath without really recapping it in a meaningful way at all, it kind of still makes sense. Like, Fear Itself stands in just fine for Schism. So, Max, as somebody who hasn't read Schism and only, I think, vaguely knows what happened in it, did you wind up with a lot of questions when you get to 544? Or were you like, oh yeah, the band broke up? Like, how obvious was it to you?
The latter. But, I mean, with a lot of stuff, especially with X-Men stuff, there's usually so many titles tied into anything that's happening. Whenever something happens that happened in something that I haven't read, I'm just like, okay, I guess that has some kind of logical explanation in something I haven't read yet.
Right, which is just comics, right? Kids these days on the Reddits, are like, what if I have to skip one issue because it was left out in the... I'm like, baby, do you know what it used to be like back in the day when you would have one issue from 1985 and the next issue you had was from 1990? Like, you skipped all sorts of issues. I promise you, baby, you're going to survive when you miss that one issue. It is going to be okay.
Well, it kind of ties into the thing that we talked about earlier, where in the olden days, they would have every comic designed to be your first possible comic. So everything would have like a recap thing. And nowadays, most superheroes in this day and age are so ubiquitous that you don't really need a recap or anything of them. So they just trust readers to just figure it out, you know?
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting about this issue is it's a very strange final issue. It starts out with a scene that's like from the original X-Men #1 from 1963, but it's with Jack Kirby's original art, but it's the X-Men being like, Jean's like, I'm dead now, and Cyclops is like, I lead the mutant race, and it's kind of them showing how far we've come from that. But then we get the whole issue. It's so interesting. There's only two things that happen. One thing is that it's being narrated by Mr. Sinister, who we learn over the course of the issue is iteratively destroying his bodies if they feel like he feels like they're being too sympathetic and how they're retelling the story of the X-Men falling apart until he gets a appropriately merciless one. This is the beginning of Sassy Sinister. Kieron Gillen invents Sassy Sinister. This is Sassy Sinister origins, this issue. But then the other thing is the schism has already happened. The lines have already been drawn, and we're basically just seeing the X-Men get on the jet. Like the whole issue is really just Iceman saying goodbye to Cyclops. That's really the only other story beat that's getting played here. There's no Wolverine. It's not Beast shows up for a second. We don't really play a lot of the Kitty and Colossus stuff. That already happened last issue. It's really just Cyclops breaking up with Iceman, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, to mainly linger on the first thing you mentioned, the thing about Gillen that I really enjoy is that, to me, he is very much influenced by Douglas Adams. Hugely. If you read his Sword mini, that's basically him doing Hitchhiker. But when you see how he writes Sinister and how frivolous Sinister is when it comes to death and killing off clones, that is so very much Douglas Adams to me.
Hickman picks up so much stuff from Gillen. And I mean, we don't need to get into all the Krakoa of it all. Look, if y'all help us make this a long-running series that goes hundreds of episodes, we'll get into all sorts of Krakoa. But Hickman picks up Sassy Sinister. Hickman picks up wholesale this whole idea of Sinister remaking himself over and over again. Like, that's the whole central plot of Krakoa in a lot of ways. It's like this issue has all of the DNA of Krakoa to the extent that you can almost read this issue as like Krakoa issue 0, which is crazy because it's from almost 10 years prior, 9 years prior. But I just think it's an interesting cycle from the Douglas Adams influence to then getting that interpreted by Kieron Gillen and then that getting interpreted later by Hickman. But like Hickman absolutely has a humorous quality to him that is very Douglas Adams influenced. If you've ever read his indie stuff like Manhattan Projects, he definitely has that influence. He doesn't just usually show it off too much at Marvel. That's much more how he is on his indie stuff. So it's just like a really interesting cycle. Like I think part of why over time I've gained more and more appreciation from this Gillen run is that none of the good stuff that happened in X-Men after this happens without Gillen. Revolutionary Cyclops doesn't happen without Gillen. Krakoa doesn't happen without Gillen. Sassy Sinister doesn't happen without Gillen. Gillen is the creator of all of this. But then it ends with Scott saying they've all gone back to school and I don't want to do that. Why would I want to do that? Which I think to me is like emblematic of how I feel about X-Men on the whole. Like this, now that I've read this Cyclops in this issue, I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to go back to school in the comics or the movies. It's over. Gillen ended it. That period ended in 2011 for me, 2010.
Yeah, very much. Embrace Alice Cooper. School's out.
Yeah, forever. Maybe we'll listen to some Alice Cooper at some point. But look, we're done with our comic book and we're going to move into our listening. So the thing that we listened to today, one of my most influential and favorite artists of all time, and I've learned from talking to Max that the same is true for him as well, it is David Bowie. And it is David Bowie's album, Let's Dance, from 1983. Now, this is after his Eno period. It is also after Scary Monsters, which was a little bit of a return to rock roots for him. And this album is produced not by Brian Eno, but by Nile Rodgers, who was one of the songwriters and musicians behind the band Chic, and who was a big tastemaker at this time. And this is Bowie basically wholeheartedly diving into, I'm just going to do 80s stadium rock. All of that gender play, all of that ambiguity, all of that kind of winking stuff is going to be left behind. Or is it? Because can Bowie really not be David Bowie?
Right. Well, that brings up a very interesting point to me, because there were songs in this record that made me go, this song is very Bowie.
Yeah.
But then it's like, okay, but what makes it a Bowie thing or not? Because some tracks on here did not make me go, oh, this is Bowie. This made me go, can I skip this one? But it won't. That's cheating. Yeah.
This record may have the biggest concentration of my least favorite Bowie songs on the album, which is funny to say because it's only 8 tracks. And I swear I did not do this deliberately, picking two runs that I feel kind of uneven about in the first episode of our show. It just felt like, oh, we should start with Kieron Gillen. It should be said, I didn't say this. Kieron Gillen is my favorite X-Men writer. I just don't really like that first Break World arc. I can't wait until we get to the second half of it on a future episode. And David Bowie is one of my 3 favorite musicians of all time. But this record. But here's what's really interesting. So we already talked about the first track, Modern Love. If you want to see that, we did a patrons only pilot episode where we kind of figured out all this technology and how it was going to work. And we had, I think, a very entertaining discussion about Modern Love, which means the first song that we're going to hear on this record is China Girl. But I want to skip China Girl for a second because you do not want to hear me start with China Girl. And I want to talk about the title track, Let's Dance. Let's Dance, I'm so interested to hear you talk about it musically, but the one thing I want to say is an introduction to it. First of all, no, there's a lot of things, but I just want to start with a simple statement. Somehow, David Bowie's invitation to put on your red shoes and dance the blues, great line, somehow still feels like it's happening in some post-apocalyptic world, because that is the flavor that Bowie brings to everything. It really feels like there's this implication of as the nuclear bombs are falling. And I don't think he ever really says that in the lyrics here, but maybe that's what you're talking about, like what makes a song feel like Bowie. I realize my whole life I've always assumed some kind of apocalypse is happening around them, and that's why he's like, let's dance. It's almost like it's an order, it's a command, but it's almost a threat, like let's dance. And I don't know, that's how I've always experienced it. But what do you think about what Let's Dance?
Well, I mean, the title alone to me is very interesting because they have a play on it with the album cover. Because Let's Dance is also like an invitation to fight, you know?
Yeah, and he's with the boxing gloves.
Exactly, yeah. But so we're gonna talk quite extensively about vocal stylings on another track. But the way Bowie sings depends on the character he's playing in the song. Basically, that's how I interpret it. So in this one, the way he sings that part, you know, putting your red shoes and dance, it's very low in its register, and it's pretty monotonous. It isn't a very melodic type of thing. If you were to play that like just on an instrument devoid of all the other instruments in the track, it will be difficult to recognize because it isn't like a very catchy hook by itself. The hook comes in the melody that's happening. You have can you pick up the guitar a bit there? And then you have the guitars and the bass are basically doing like a question and answer type thing, where one something up and then it gets answered by the bass.
There is this crosstalk between the two instruments, and it's kind of like Bowie in the middle. There's like a little bit of like a tug of war happening between the guitar rhythm and the bass, and they integrate so well that at first, if you're just listening to it in a casual way, I don't think like that's never really occurred to me. And I've played this song, I know the parts of this song, but like I do think you're right that there's like a little bit of a crosstalk. But the thing that always sticks out to me about this song is that because this album starts with Modern Love, which has a very kind of Little Richard sock hop feel to it that's very retro, and not really a lot of the rest of the record has that. But Let's Dance starts with this big vocal harmony build, very Beatlesy, very twist and shout, growing. And then it grows out of that into that really stark bump, bump, bump bass line. And you think like, well, was that like a bait and switch? Like, is that not going to come back? But then you get this beautiful relief of the B section of the song, the if you say run. I love that part. And it just, I think he really plays with that idea that he's playing two different vocal characters, because that part, it almost feels like cooling water being like poured out by him vocally onto this after this very stark, menacing, almost confrontational other part where he's playing this very cynical croon. And then when it gets to the breaks my heart in two, and it goes and it does the build again, and you get so excited, and then it goes back to that really like icy crosstalk between the guitar and the bass. To me, that's what makes this song so remarkable. I don't think it's a great song. I don't even think it has the best lyrics on this album, but I think that with the way that it plays with dynamics is actually fascinating, and that's what probably made it so sticky on the radio at that time.
Yeah, So I don't want to dwell on this song too long because I could talk about any song for like an hour. But so the first thing that they're setting up at the beginning, which is like the Beatles or Isley Brothers type of E flat 7 in this case. Whenever you have a 7 chord, I don't want it to go down. In this case, you wanted to go down to the root. You wanted to go down to A flat, basically. You wanted to go from to, but it doesn't. Instead, as soon as the music starts, it kind of goes to B flat Dorian, which would be a B flat minor type thing. It goes there, essentially. And it kind of keeps playing by not going to the A flat till you get to the point where you just mentioned the so it kind of teases that and puts the expectation of it in your subconscious.
Well, and that's why it feels
then,
so relieving when it gets there. I mean, music
Yeah.
can do that, right? Like if you tease and tease and tease the person long enough, and then you finally give the melodic or harmonic resolve to that tease, it does feel soothing.
Yes, very much. When I one of the music schools I went to before I went to conservatory, I had a teacher who taught ensemble arranging and conducting, and he basically told me that music is only tension and release. That's basically all it is.
Yeah. But that brings us to China Girl. And Bowie, I've always found this song deeply problematic. It's not because I'm woke now. I think even as a kid, I was like, this is strange. And to me, it has better context when you realize that Bowie originally wrote this for Iggy Pop, and Iggy Pop recorded it on a record in a much slower, but somehow more menacing version in the 70s. And Bowie, it's like he's like crooning it like it's a little bit more of a love song, which I think makes the lyrics even weirder and more disturbing. And then we come to a thing that I need you, Max, my musician friend, to explain this to me. So China Girl has this very kind of like dark, somber tone, and then it has this very kind of like, the guitar is very different, and Nile Rodgers adds it. I know you're about to play it. It goes the do 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 do. It sounds, which is a great riff. Why does it sound so different than the rest of the song? And why do some people say, oh, well, that's meant to be like an Asian influenced riff, as if we're talking about like a fusion meal just because something got soy sauce on it? Like, why do people have that reaction to that riff in China Girl? Explain it, Professor Max.
Okay, well, they're using pentatonics. That's basically the thing that ties
acapella band wasn't around back then, Max.
That's true. Okay, well, let's get into terminology a little bit. So penta just means 5,
right?
And tonics are the notes you use. So let's say you have a major scale, which would be a heptatonic scale because you'd have 7 notes. So like G major.
Yeah.
So if you want to make that a pentatonic scale, or the most well-known one, you would take away the half steps. So if you were to look at the thing on the guitar and would play it all in one string, you would have the first note, then a whole step up, then a whole step up, then a half step, then a whole step up, whole step up, whole step up, and then a half step. So you have a half step going from 3 to 4 and from 7 to 1. Now, if you take away the 4, you wouldn't have the half step that's interfering with the 3 anymore. And you can't take away the 1 because that would be strange. So you'd have to take away the 7. So that leaves you with this scale. And that sounds like 6 notes, but it's because the starting note and the last note are the same one, right? That's actually the scale. And in a lot of traditional, as far as I'm aware of, Chinese music is based on pentatonics. So you would have stuff like it's kind of like the stock thing you would hear in.
I mean, it immediately
like
takes me to that place.
Right. It's also the scales basically used in those type of things. You hear Bowie outline the scale and perfectly when you have the start where you have the. You hear him sing. You hear him go.
oh, yeah.
Right. That's the pentatonic scale, like starting with a G, going down to an A.
Interesting. And because you know what I've learned, I have this book here, one that I originally bought just when he passed away, and I've been waiting for 10 years to do some kind of project about David Bowie where I get to refer to this. That's about the recording of
Yeah.
every David Bowie song. It's the complete David Bowie, and it has sort of all of his songs, all of his albums, all of his live stuff. And Nile Rodgers added that riff to the song. If you go and listen to the Iggy Pop version, it's not there. And so it's really
Hmm.
interesting that I don't think that vocal, I mean, I was listening to the Iggy Pop version earlier. I don't think that, I don't think that's there in the Iggy Pop one. And so what happened was Nile Rodgers, he said he was very nervous about bringing it to Bowie because he thought Bowie was going to hate it. And then Bowie winds up liking it. And obviously Nile Rodgers, a genius for many reasons, but because that actually did
Mm-hmm.
cement the connection to, Chinese influenced music in a way that the original did not have. And then Bowie, also a genius, echoes it back in the vocal. You've
Yeah.
now made me like this song for the first time in the 43 years that this song has existed, Max. He's like talking about it, my little China girl, and he's gonna like and like cooing about her. And Bowie, looking back later, says Asian culture has had a fairly high profile within my work from the early 1970s, but I don't know if that excuses the song. And then at one point he's saying that he's coming into town like a sacred cow with visions of swastikas in my head, which is so hard to characterize why he's talking about that based on the information that is in the rest of the song. I just read it
Right.
as one of Bowie's classic, like there's always like a little bit of an apocalyptic dystopia happen at the corners of all of his songs, but there's
Right.
absolutely nothing in the song to explain why he's talking about swastikas.
Well, I mean, aren't the lyrics written by Iggy Pop?
I think Bowie wrote it for, no, they co-wrote it. So
Right.
I guess that could
So
be the Iggy of it all.
so to talking about vocals stylings, Iggy Pop, who I am always amazed that he's still alive, but I'm a big fan of the Stooges, and with his Stooges work, he's very much well, he sounds like a combination between Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, and a metric ton of drugs. And in his more solo stuff, when he's like, I'm the passenger and stuff, he sings like he's a combination of Elvis and I guess a different kind of drugs than the ones Elvis was taking. And I
I
feel like
which I love. I
in,
love Olive. I love Iggy Pop.
oh yeah, no judging. Just,
Yeah.
wow, you're still alive.
But
Good for
I
you,
guess
Iggy.
to your point, like written perhaps for Iggy to deliver, and it certainly comes off differently from him than it does from David Bowie.
Yeah, but I also feel like Bowie is kind of singing in that kind of way because he doesn't he goes into like a pseudo crooner type thing, which he doesn't really do on other tracks on this record as much. He's very low thing and long notes and everything. It's stands out to me.
Well, those first three songs are the really big songs from this record. Although there's another song later in the record that was a hit, which is Cat People, which we'll get to. But really, Modern Love, Let's Dance, and China Girl were the three that made a big impact on the charts. And then there's a lot of very little known Bowie songs in this record. The next one on the record is Without You. And I had never really listened to this that closely, although I've listened to Let's Dance for many years. Over the course of preparing for this, I've become obsessed with this song. It's so beautiful and gentle, and Bowie is singing in this mixed voice that he very rarely sings in up through this point, although it becomes more and more of a hallmark of him in the 80s. And I'm just really fascinated by it because I don't think it's a choice he would have made before the Eno years. Like, even though he's always played with his voice in songs and the way he uses his voice in songs, this kind of very pretty, gentle version. And I just love the way that the bass kind of drives the song and he's floating so far above it. It's just and the bass kind of just like constantly churns and his voice is up here, and it's just like creates this very trance-like quality. I find that it's almost hard for me to pay attention to it closely because it kind of just like sends me to a place.
Well, I feel very similar as to you do because this one really stuck out to me as being pretty much the most typical 80s pop song to me. Like it could have been a song by like the Simple Minds or something. Like it felt very much like that to me. And I liked it. This definitely isn't my least favorite song. We'll get to that one in a second.
Yes, we will.
I No, I like this one. It's very simple chord wise as well. I mean, it's just B flat, E flat, and A flat. Which, if you look at it, it looks like it'll be in the key of E flat, but it's actually in B flat, and it just goes to the fourth and the flat seven, which you could read as being in B flat mixolydian, or something if you would choose to.
Well, and that next song is one of the Bowie songs I hate the most of any Bowie song I've ever heard, which is Ricochet.
Yeah.
It's so hard to describe.
Awful.
It's like, it's awful. It's like Bowie's, I will say that lyrically, Bowie's selling the dystopia a little bit more in this one, but it's like Bowie talking about machines and factories over reggae. Like, it's so hard to describe what it actually is.
It's something that I mean, I don't want to be too rough on it because it does feel rude since I hold Bowie in such high regard. But I had a difficulty, like I had to really control myself to not skip this song every time I listened to the record because it did not bring me joy. It brought me annoyance. I thought I'm usually not a big fan of like a big stomping type of percussion going on and then just vocals, and just it sounds very like, well, dystopic, I guess, to me. I just don't like it. I don't like this song.
But it's interesting because it brought up something to me as we move to the next song, which is Criminal World, which I did not know this before doing some research for the show. This is not a David Bowie song. He did not write this. It was originally released by the band Metro. And at the time, it was banned by the BBC, presumably for being too bisexual. Like it's definitely got some gender politics in it. The one lyric that always sticks out to me is the boys are like baby-faced girls, and it's really playing with androgyny, which of course Bowie would be attracted to. So I think it's interesting that this song on this record that Bowie very much is like, no, I'm very masculine. I'm on the cover with boxing gloves. We're dancing, definitely with a woman. That he very deliberately picks this one cover song that is all about androgyny, which almost, it feels like on the rest of the album, Bowie's like, shh, forget about that.
Yeah, that's a good one. This is also what stands out to me is that it is the only song not written by Bowie. It's also the only song on the record that has full diatonic chords. So not a terminology corner type thing. Diatonic just means they only use notes and chords from the scale that of what key it's in, basically. So every other song has chords that don't really match up with the scale but resolve because tension and release. But this one just has strictly chords from the key.
Interesting. And I wonder if that's just because it's not, penned by Bowie, and so it just has a different feel to it. I will say, though, that even though it's different than the other songs in that way, to me, it really cements something about the bass in this record, which I think is very emblematic of the time in the early 80s. And, this is a very bass-driven record. The bass really feels like on every song, it's playing with like sevenths, like it's always stepping back on all of the bass riffs to create this little walk back and forward. It never kind of strides, it never goes up the neck. It's always this like bum 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 bum, and that's like the bass on Let's Dance, the bass on China Girl, the bass on Ricochet, the bass on Criminal World. They all kind of have that same thing, and by this point in the record, I'm like, oh, it's actually the bass kind of like unifies the record. Bowie's vocals certainly don't. The style of the songs certainly don't. We totally left behind that kind of retro feel at this point. And you even just said that this song, from a chord structure standpoint, is very different than the others. But I do think that the bass is actually very similar across the entire record.
Yeah, I would agree. I think sound-wise, it's mostly pretty consistent. Like the sound that Steve Ray Vaughan has on his guitar is the same throughout. It's always a strat with a little drive on it, and the bass is always very it's a very bright bass, which is very of the time.
Yeah,
kind of started like in the I always think of Mark Miller for Marcus Miller for that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think sound-wise, it's pretty consistent.
Well, and that brings us to another really interesting track here. And it's almost like every track doesn't fit here, but that's because it's a record called Let's Dance, and you're thinking, oh, might there be dance music? No, well, I mean, sort of, kind of, Cat People Putting Out Fire is a Giorgio Moroder track that Bowie had sang on for a soundtrack a few years prior. This is a re-recording. It's a bit
Yep.
faster. It has less synths. Of course, Moroder is like known as the kind of like father of modern synth stuff. And I actually like this version a little bit more. It's because it's a little faster. It's a little more raw and like desperate sounding. And he says we're going to put out the fire by pouring on gasoline. That's not how you put out fires, David. What are you doing?
Right. That's counterproductive.
But it's interesting that this record is like so short. It's only an 8-track record. And one of the songs is a cover that he pulled from the 1970s. And another song is like a song that he just recorded to modest success for the soundtrack. So it's really only like a 6-song album ultimately, which is interesting to think about. And then it ends on this song, Shake It, which to me, pour moi, this is the only song in the whole record that feels like it's on the record called Let's Dance. And not just because it's called Shake It, but because I could actually think about moving my ass to this song in a way that I don't think I could say for any of the other songs on the record.
Right. Well, this to me sounds like the most Bowie song on the entire thing, which is, comes back to what makes something sound like a specific thing. Well, to me, it sounds like it's basically a loop of 3 different chords, but it introduces every one of those chords as the new key. It's kind of hard to explain why, but it's just because of how they're played and presented, I suppose. And that makes it sound a little off because it makes it like a little bit insecure about how to where to go, basically. And then you have that counter bit with the other part where it basically just goes to it's in G, and it just goes to the 1, the 4, and the 5. It's very much straightforward, just we're in G, baby.
Well, and it's an interesting conflict between Bowie's typical writing style, which definitely is often non-diatonic, and the style that Nile Rodgers is bringing, like chic, songs. That particular realm of guitar-driven disco did not always follow like very obvious kind of like 1-4-5 type of chord structures. And then like the 80s rock, which actually is often very simple. Like when you go back and listen to a lot of the songs from this period, like and you strum them on a guitar, you just play them on a piano, they're not often very complex. The complexity is coming from like the layers or the basses introducing it or the synthesizers, but the actual chord structure is very simple. So it's like a really interesting grab bag of influences, and then we're done. And so the thing that I come to is like, what did this record make you feel? This David Bowie record, which I've listened to every David Bowie record at some point, but I've never listened to this with this kind of intent. And I don't think you had either. So what did you come away feeling?
I liked this, some of them more than I thought I would, and Ricochet is something that I don't want to listen to ever again. But I had grown appreciation for China Girl and Let's Dance after digging into it musically. Without You, I liked from the start, and I really like Shake It, probably my favorite one on the record. Tied with Without You, and Cat People is fun. Criminal World, I'm not too fussed about, but overall it's fine. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Bowie era.
What's interesting for me is I think I've always, because I always knew the singles and I didn't know the record tracks that well, like I couldn't have sung any of them to you the way I can now, that I kind of always assumed that this part of the 80s of Bowie was a lot more sprightly than it was. I think I was kind of in my head merging in some influences from Labyrinth and some influence from is it Never Let Me Go, that's the 1987, and all of those other ones. And I kind of forgot like how weird and sparse this was, but it makes sense to me because even Bowie, the great pretender that Bowie was, trying to do this chameleonic thing, he hasn't fully transformed yet, and so it's hard for him to totally let go of like this cynicism, this dark angle. Like he's always writing music for a George Orwell book. He's always talking about the rise and fall of some messianic figure. It's kind of just baked in a little bit. And even Bowie trying to have this big pop moment, which was his biggest crossover, so there's nothing wrong with it, but like even Bowie in that mode kind of can't help himself to create like a weird, dark creepy album, and everybody still loved it. And actually, it's later in the 80s when Bowie starts to like really lean into like, oh look, I'm just a pop artist, that people start being like, oh, this is bad David Bowie, because it stops feeling so familiar. As weird as this album is as a listen, it's still very familiar as a David Bowie record, even though it's not doing all of the David Bowie things that you know from his glam rock era or from his Brian Eno era.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Bowie's stuff is always like laced with cynicism, musically or lyrically. And it's do you remember that Outcast song Hey Ya?
How could you forget it?
Well, I mean, it was a massive hit, but in the lyrics, it's one of the most like cynical, pessimistic stuff ever. It's like the lyric, if they say love, if they say nothing lasts forever, then what makes love the exception? Stuff like that. Which is, and then I think in the song he goes something like, you don't want to hear, you don't want to listen to the lyrics, you just want to dance, or something like that. Which is very much, to me, kind of sums up Bowie's hits. Because if you listen to them, most of them are pretty depressing.
Well, and it goes back to a song that we didn't actually talk about in today's program because we did it on the pilot, but the first song on the record, Modern Love, one of the lyrics that really stuck with me is, there's no sign of life, it's just the power to charm. And to me, that is the thesis statement of the record. It's Bowie, very, very cynical, but Bowie always, even at his most cynical, has the power to charm. So Max, as we wrap up here, when we do wrap up, I ask you to shelve, store, or sell, not something we've talked about, but a concept. So the idea of shelve, store, or sell is, what would you proudly display and use all the time that you would shelve it? What would you store, meaning kind of tuck it away, it's in your attic crawl space, you don't need to see it, but you don't need to throw it away, versus sell, which is like, I'd rather just have the cash value. So today's trio of things, I was thinking about the 6 classical forms of art that was before the addition of cinema as the 7th art by Italian and French critic Ricciotto Canudo, when he added cinema. So the original 6 were architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, or we could say more broadly literature, and theater, sometimes said as dance. So in the scope of any episode of Ink and Wax, we're going to talk about literature and painting in the comic book side, and we're going to talk about music. So today I want you to please shelve, store, or sell architecture, sculpture, or paint, or not paintings, architecture, sculpture, or theater, please.
Oh, well, I would shelve theater because I'm also involved in theater, and I like every aspect of it. I would store architecture, and I would then sell sculpture.
Interesting. I would. I really like sculpture. One of my favorite things about going to like a classic art museum like the Louvre is to like get right up on classical sculpture and see the way that captured form at the time. And it's so interesting to me to think about it as like separate from painting and separate from architecture, and sculpture at that time really was almost like capturing something on video. Like it was the best version sometimes that a thing could get captured in. That said, I don't know that I need sculpture like behind me on a video on a shelf every time I'm making a video. And theater is just too influential for me because part of my degree is in theater. It's where I learned all these talents that I bring to you here on the show. So architecture, there's that great quote that like writing about music is like dancing about architecture. I don't really even know I don't know how to dance about architecture. I don't know how to talk about architecture. I have a lot of architect friends who are so talented, but it's just a complete mystery to me. So I think I'm going to need to sell architecture because it's the one of the 3, and certainly the one of the 6 that I just can't articulate well. I'm going to store sculpture because I do really appreciate it, and sometimes I want to know that I still have it. And I think I'm going to shelve right behind me theater because there's no modern day crisis without theater, I don't think.
Fair.
Well, Max, please remind everyone where they can find you when you wish to be found on the internet.
You can find me on my YouTube channel, which is my name, Max Appelman. And you can find me on Instagram, which is also my name, because I'm the same person on both.
Excellent. You can find Max here with another episode upcoming of Ink and Wax. I have been Krisis with a K, so please join us next time for another discussion of comics and music here on Ink and Wax. And until then, don't have a crisis. Unless, of course, it's me.